What is up, my people, and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Equestrian Physio On Air. That sounds really weird to say. So I've been thinking about kind of moving forward with a podcast for a while for a few reasons, but one of them is like when I listen to other people, other creators who I highly respect, other people in the strength and conditioning world who I highly respect, when I listen to their longer format content, a lot of the time the sense that I get, either they say it directly or they don't, is that it is really nice to have the option for longer form medium. So Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, all of these, content platforms can be really amazing for sharing information, sharing little bites of education, but they are limited in the way that people digest them. You have a very short attention span for most people. You have mostly visual media. So you're trying to pack all this information into a tiny little hook or phrase, hoping that someone will actually read the caption to get a little bit more nuance to it. But really, you're kind of leaving that up to a whim. And I find with my platform, I am guilty of this as well, where sometimes the message gets lost or sometimes you miss the forest for the trees simply because it's not structured or it's not nuanced enough or it's not laid out in kind of like a foundations first way. It presents little tidbits of information, and often us being human beings, we love to latch on to kind of like new, shiny, and novel, and we miss the foundational principles. So what I really wanted to do was start a little bit more of an open-ended medium, having a little bit more longer format content available for you guys, so that if you want to listen to me ramble on, if you want to hear about my musings, if you want to, hear me elaborate on some of these concepts that I talk about, you have that option. So yeah, whether I keep up with this, whether this is just a fluke, who knows? But I really did want to experiment. I really did want to try and see if this was a medium that I liked and if this is a medium that resonates with you guys, and we can go from there. It's not going to be anything fancy. You're probably going to catch me mostly in like 20-minute slots between clients or sitting in my car, eating lunch, where I just kind of like have some concept I want to riff on, and that's what you're going to get. That said, though, I hope this really becomes more of an interactive thing as well, even though podcasts are generally fairly one-sided unless you're doing interviews or conversations. I really hope that you guys will engage with it. I really hope that you will send me questions, concepts, things to cover, and that this can be a conversation, even if it's a little bit asynchronously, through all of you. Anyways, without further ado, welcome to the Equestrian Physio On Air. Let's roll the tape. Hey, I'm Katie. I'm a physiotherapist, strength and conditioning coach, and lifelong rider dedicated to helping equestrians build strong, capable, resilient bodies, both in and out of the saddle. This podcast is here to empower riders of all levels with evidence-informed rehab, training, and education. And we're not just here to follow tradition for tradition's sake. We're here to challenge outdated norms and bring critical thinking and curiosity to how we train, ride, and show up. Let's get into it. So moving into today's topic, one thing I wanted to dive into was a post that I made this morning around how we structure training for equestrians. And this is where it's a great example of where that forest for the trees message gets lost, where this is a post that, not very many people are going to see, and it's probably not going to gain a lot of traction. But at the same time, this is something that's setting a foundation for a lot of the other things that I post, a lot of the other content that I put out that is presenting more nuanced or singular kind of topics. So in the post, what you'll see is a pyramid diagram. And essentially all I was trying to do was lay out how we design and build a successful training program or a successful resistance training workout for equestrians. So at the bottom of the pyramid, the foundation for anyone's training program, the foundation for where we all start, is just, what do you need as a human? Like when we look at general activity guidelines, whether it's from the WHO, Canadian activity guidelines, the US guidelines, they're all very similar. It is, what does the research say is kind of the minimum for us just to reduce injury, reduce all-cause mortality and morbidity. I'm going to keep it in, guys, because that is going to be the realism of this podcast as you get all of my little bumbles. So what are the things that we need to just generally decrease all-cause mortality and morbidity and just keep us like relatively healthy as human beings? This is often where I struggle because I often get a lot of people commenting on my posts or reaching out to me saying like, how do I find an exercise to stop my lower leg from swinging? What is the exercise that I should do for my tennis elbow? What is the exercise that I should do for my low back pain? What is the thing that I can do to even out my seat bones? And that's great. Like, those are great questions to ask. But at the same time, my kind of sassy answer back is always just, are you doing any training at the moment? Like, have you kind of hit your foundational principles yet? Have you done anything to get started? And then from there, we can look at, okay, where do we need to refine? Do we need to cut things back? Do we need to build things up? What is the magic ticket in your scenario? Because very rarely is it just, okay, do this one exercise and fix it. So the Canadian Activity Guidelines, WHO, US, like I said, they're all very similar. And it just looks like 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous cardio per week. Usually if you're more in that vigorous category, you can have that in like closer to the 75 to 100 minutes. But then if you're more of a moderate level cardio, you want that in like 150. For a lot of us equestrians, we get that through riding, right? If we're doing, 4 or 5 rides a week where we are getting our heart rate up, we are riding for 30 or 40 minutes, we are building up our cardio base that way. That is often checking that box. Would more be better? Usually, because then we get to the higher pieces of the pyramid where we're working at performance, but this is literally just the basics that we need for health. On top of that, we want to be training 2 times per week. So that is resistance training, hitting all of our major muscle groups. What does that mean? That means we want to hit all the major muscle groups that are going to function and be really important to our activities of daily living. Those are things like our calves, our quadriceps, our posterior chain, like our glutes and our hamstrings, our low back, our hip flexors, our upper body, upper back, our chest, our arms. All of these muscle groups are really important for us just navigating day-to-day life. And these are the things that if we neglect them, it might not be an issue now, it might not be an issue in 10 years, but by the time that we're 75, 85, 95, that is where not training these things catch up with us. And that is why that twice a week resistance training is the bare minimum. What does that look like? We can build a very simple training program around just a few functional movements. So I like to break it down into 6, and these are not my foundational movements. These are based on, principles that have been around in strength conditioning for a long period of time. But that includes your squat movements, some sort of hinge movement like a deadlift or a hip thrust, usually a push and a pull, and you can kind of break that up again into like an overhead versus a horizontal push and pull. Some sort of lunge, so we're getting unilateral work, and core. Now, this is where I will usually start. So if someone's coming to me and saying, okay, well, my lower leg is swinging, how do I fix that? I will say to them, are you doing this? Are you training at least twice a week, hitting these basic movement patterns? Squat, hinge, push, pull, lunge, and some sort of core. That's it. That is the starting point for most people. And if you're not hitting that, then yeah, we can get into the nitty gritty of why your lower leg is swinging, but hitting this will probably cover you, and you will probably see significant improvement without us having to do that big analysis. So if you're doing all of that, what is step 2? How do we then take a program that's literally just, covering us as a human being, keeping us healthy, and turn it into, quote unquote, an equestrian program? This is where we start getting into more sport specificity. So if you talk to athletic trainers, if you talk to strength and conditioning coaches, anyone who has kind of done the National Strength and Conditioning Association courses, this is where we will break down what's called a needs analysis. So as an equestrian coach, I will usually look at riding as a whole and start breaking down what does an equestrian actually need to be able to train and be successful in the saddle. Now, again, thinking that, okay, we've covered major muscle groups. What do we need on top of that? We need a lot of mobility demands because we are trying to, number one, wrap our legs around the horse. That's quite a lot. A lot of mobility demands in the hip, a lot of mobility demands in the low back. And then we also need to be able to match the movement of the horse. And if you think about it proportionally, the horse is a much bigger mover than we are. So the horse moving at like 20% of their mobility might take 80% of ours. A horse moving at 70 or 80% of mobility might take 100% of ours, and that's why we need to build up our mobility capacity. So that's where, for equestrians, I will start to bias towards hip mobility. I will start to bias towards low back mobility. I will start to bias towards posterior chain strength because we need to be able to keep ourselves tall, to apply kind of a braking force when we're in the saddle. All of those kinds of things build up. So I take that basic training program, squat, hinge, push, pull, lunge, and core, and I start to refine it. where I'm not throwing everything out, but I'm adding in or biasing these needs of the general equestrian. So what's the next step on top of that? That's where I start to look at, okay, what is the discipline that we're training for? What is the individual level that that rider is at? And then we start to bias the program more for that individual discipline. I'll give you an example. So if I'm training a barrel racer, they have to handle a lot of lateral forces and a lot of very sharp acceleration and deceleration. So I am training them with a lot of unilateral movements. I am training them with a lot of lateral movements. I'm training them with a lot of power movements, and I'm probably training more anterior core than I might otherwise, simply because they have to handle those forces trying to pull them to the outside as they're going around a barrel, and they have to handle the acceleration of their horse and the deceleration of their horse coming into and out of a barrel. And so they need strength, particularly through the muscle groups that handle that. And that's not just strength because they're going so fast, they need power. Contrast that with a dressage rider who does need power and does need a lot of strength still, because if you're riding a big mover, don't tell me you don't need power to actually control and absorb those forces. But at the same time, they ride in a much longer position. They're much deeper in the saddle. They're maintaining the contact of their body through that whole dressage test because they have to be that accurate with their aids. So I'm working on longer positions. I'm working on mobility more. I'm biasing that program to really work on muscle length and strength. So maybe more eccentric work. It's not that we're neglecting those foundational components, and it's not that the dressage riders aren't getting lateral power and that the rodeo riders aren't getting mobility. It's just, what are we biasing here? And I am building that up depending on the level of the rider. Lastly, we start looking at the individual. And this is where we perform, again, what's called an individual needs analysis. So we will do an assessment on that individual and we will test, okay, what's your strength or endurance through different muscle groups? What does your symmetry look like? What does your mobility look like? We start to develop a list of the actual impairments or weaknesses that that rider is experiencing. And again, we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and we don't completely rewrite this program, but we start to bias what the foundational components of that program already are. And we will slowly build in more movements that will address these impairments, right? If a rider struggles with hip mobility, then they might get one or two extra hip mobility movements into their weekly program. Or they might even just have other mobility movements, tossed out just for that time and hip mobility prioritized until it's a little bit better. The last piece of the puzzle is kind of your prehab or rehab needs. So if someone is actually dealing with an injury, if someone is actually dealing with pain, that is where we might be scaling things back. We might be building things up. We might be changing things within the program based on that person's rehab needs. So if you have low back pain, perhaps we're avoiding heavy deadlifting for a little while and we're sticking to maybe a rack pull so that we're limiting the range of motion. If you have plantar fascial pain or plantar heel pain, perhaps we are emphasizing calf work or Achilles work or calf raises within that program to try and address that need. The reason we don't address individual needs or rehab needs first is that often they are already addressed in the bottom of the pyramid. If we're covering those basic movements, if we're covering what the average equestrian needs, if we're covering what they need for their discipline and their level, often their rehab and their individual needs are getting covered. So it might be one little swap, one little tweak to additionally emphasize those individual or those rehab needs. I hope that makes sense. I hope you guys can visualize it. If you are struggling, I'll see if I can put this in the show notes, at least a link to the actual visual. But I think at the end of the day, it's just really good to note that when we are in this world of, Instagram showing flashy single exercises, quick fixes, or hacks for certain conditions, we need to remember what the base of things actually are. There's no point jumping on the bandwagon of trying to fix one of those individual or rehab needs if you aren't already laying the foundation, right? It can be easy to miss the forest for the trees, but we always want to stick with those basics first. And once we are checking those boxes, then we can start to emphasize those individual needs a little bit more. Cool. So thanks for sticking with me, guys. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Really excited to launch this new medium for you. Really looking forward to your feedback. So please feel free to message me and let me know what you think about it. And I'll see you on the next one.